Settle in for a deep dive into something that, well, affects us all, often without us even realizing it. We've got a stack of fascinating material here, unpacking what's often called brainwashing, but really it's a look at the powerful ways our minds are influenced.
That's right. And the term brainwashing, it first gained widespread attention around 1950. It was actually a translation of the Chinese word "sinao," meaning to cleanse the mind. This was during the Korean War, you see, when reports emerged of American POWs collaborating with the enemy. That sparked fears of these insidious, sort of never-before-seen techniques.
And you can absolutely see why that would cause panic. Reports varied, but figures claiming up to 70% of U.S. prisoners were swayed by propaganda, or even a third embracing the communist cause. That must have been shocking.
Yeah.
It offered a seemingly simple explanation, didn't it? These soldiers weren't making a choice. They were just innocent victims of irresistible mind control.
Exactly. But as the source material makes quite clear, brainwashing has never really been a precise technical term. It's always been this more fluid, almost magical concept, conjuring images of total unbreakable control.
And as one expert cited here points out, it absolutely is not some kind of magic spell. So this deep dive isn't just about those extreme dramatic cases you hear about, like in POW camps or cults. It's really about taking apart the individual elements, often lumped under that term, things like social conditioning, our fundamental human needs for approval, for belonging, emotional dependency, to really see how they operate to influence you and me, in our daily lives.
Yeah, it's less about exposing villains and more about just understanding the underlying process. By looking at how these powerful forces can combine to create sudden, really dramatic change, it helps us see how those very same forces might be shaping our characters, our beliefs unconsciously over much longer periods.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Let's figure out just how influenced we really are. So the Western study of brainwashing, it really kicked off with trying to understand that Korean War POW experience, right?
Yeah.
Why soldiers collaborated or made those very public confessions.
Exactly. And it also echoed earlier events, things like Stalin's Moscow show trials, remember those, where top revolutionaries made these seemingly impossible public confessions. So experts, people like Edgar Schein, Hinkle, Wolf, Mirlu, Robert Lifton, they analyzed the POW accounts. They looked at everything, the men's characters, the environmental stresses, the specific tactics the Chinese were using.
What kind of pressures were these soldiers under in those camps? It must have been immense.
Oh, immense pressure. First, you had the physical privations, very little food, long marches, constant tension. Schein points out this made it incredibly difficult for the men to maintain their group ties, support each other. Then came the intense psychological pressures, fear of never being repatriated, fear of terrible reprisals if they didn't cooperate. Their beliefs, their values, even their sense of self were systematically undermined. Group ties were actively destroyed, for instance, by encouraging informers, creating widespread distrust, leaving men just isolated and feeling profoundly alone.
Wow. Isolation and distrust. Yeah, that would certainly make anyone feel incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely. And in that state of confusion and isolation, the Chinese presented collaboration as, well, the only source of certainty and relief available.
So this wasn't just random hardship. There were deliberate applied psychological tactics at work here.
Precisely. They used direct methods like long daily lectures praising communism, disparaging the U.S. They also used indirect methods, forcing prisoners to sign petitions or make speeches calling for peace. Schein noted that confessions from high-ranking American officers, say about the U.S. using germ warfare, were particularly damaging because they came from respected figures within the men's own ranks, you see, undermining core beliefs. And one really powerful technique was just sheer repetition, making demands over and over until the men simply gave in out of exhaustion or just a desperate need to end the pressure.
And they started small, didn't they? With seemingly trivial demands and then just built up from there.
Exactly that, a careful pacing of demands. And crucially, it wasn't enough just to listen. They demanded active participation. Prisoners had to respond verbally, write things down, essentially becoming complicit in their own re-education. The Chinese also framed their indoctrination not just as political ideology, but as a plea for peace, which obviously appealed to soldiers weary of war.
The sources also go into the sort of emotional sequence this whole process aimed to induce.
Yeah. Yes. Experts like Hinkle and Wolf described a specific progression, a sequence of emotions the Chinese tried to evoke, starting with anxiety and suspense, then moving to an awareness of being avoided by others, then this sort of unfocused guilt, fear, deep uncertainty, bewilderment, depression, fatigue, and eventually just despair. This culminated in a desperate need to talk and depend on anyone friendly, which of course usually meant their interrogators, leading to an intense need for approval and increased suggestibility. The final confession brought this profound, if maybe temporary, sense of relief.
And the physical pressures weren't just about discomfort. They were deliberately used to weaken the mind, too.
Definitely. Things like semi-starvation, sleep deprivation, prolonged standing, constant tension. Hinkle explained how these states directly impact brain chemistry and function. Lack of nutrients, issues with vital organs affecting the brain's environment. These aren't minor discomforts, they actually impair cognitive ability. Hinkle suggested that while the most severe brain syndrome wasn't always obvious, those initial stages, the emotional symptoms, the vagueness, were likely present, made worse by even mundane things like isolation or repetitive forced labor, which just tire the brain over time.
Okay, so while physical stress weakens function, the sources seem to suggest that personality and mental strategies are actually key to resistance.
That's the finding, yeah. It's not just about enduring physical torture longer, but about having the internal resources, the mental toolkit, to maintain perspective and resist the psychological manipulation. Miralou even argued that training soldiers only to withstand torture could actually backfire by increasing their overall anxiety, making them more susceptible in the end. Resistance requires mental strategies, ones rooted in a more balanced perspective on life.
Now, another expert, Robert Lifton, he studied thought reform using a psychoanalytic approach. Looked at Chinese civilians in Hong Kong, right, who'd gone through similar conversion efforts. What did he find?
Lifton observed psychological forces that seemed to penetrate really deep into the individual's inner emotional world. He identified these key processes. First, an assault on identity, like telling a doctor they weren't a real doctor under the new system. Then, inducing this pervasive guilt, where external accusations from what felt like an infallible environment merged with the person's own subjective feelings of inadequacy or wrongdoing, and then forced self-betrayal, like denouncing friends or family, which felt like denouncing their entire past life. This created an intense internal conflict, leading to a breaking point where they felt alienated from themselves, terrified of annihilation, really.
That sounds incredibly disorienting, like a total loss of footing psychologically.
It is. And in that state, this compulsion to confess emerged as a way to resolve the overwhelming guilt and confusion. Confession became more and more appealing because it offered an end to the psychological pain. The amorphous guilt could then be specifically channeled and attributed to having held the wrong ideology in the past. And re-education involved coming to see Wang's whole previous life relationships, beliefs as shameful, needing to be purged.
But then embracing the new ideology offered a path to relief and belonging.
Exactly. It met those profound emotional needs. A sense of group intimacy, a clear common goal, relief from that unbearable confusion, and a feeling of harmony with their new environment. This progress and harmony culminated in a final public confession and this feeling of rebirth into the group. Lifton did note that certain factors made people more susceptible, things like having a readily accessible negative identity, maybe already feeling somewhat inadequate, or a strong susceptibility to guilt or existing identity confusion. That was particularly true for cultural outsiders.
So were all the experts on the same page about why these conversions happened?
Not entirely, no. While many like Shine, Lifton, and others agreed personality played a crucial role in resisting the pressure, one British psychiatrist, William Sargent, took a more purely physiological view. He linked sudden conversions, political, religious, whatever, directly to Pavlov's work on stress reactions in dogs. He believed personality only affected how long someone could resist before their nervous system basically collapsed, but not their ultimate immunity to breakdown and suggestibility.
Pavlov's dogs reacting to extreme stress. How did Sargent connect that to humans?
Well, Sargent saw parallels between dogs pushed to a nervous breakdown by conflicting stimuli or extreme stress. They lost learned reflexes, collapsed, and humans under intense pressure. He felt that emotional abreaction, that intense emotional discharge, sometimes seen in shell-shocked soldiers leading to recovery, was physiologically similar to the collapse seen in Pavlov's dogs. Only in humans, he thought it could be triggered by stress building up to an intolerance level, even if the stressor was imagined, not just real.
So his argument was basically that stress, regardless of why you're stressed, can lead to a physical state where you become highly suggestible, receptive to completely new ideas.
That's Sargent's core claim, yeah. And he controversially applied this idea to everything from revivalist meetings to political conversions, arguing the physiological breakdown under stress was the key factor, not intellectual persuasion. He even cited examples like the writer Arthur Koestler's decision to join the Communist Party, arguing it was precipitated by unrelated stresses like a hangover and financial loss, suggesting a physiological state just opened him up to radical change.
That's a strong claim. Almost reductive. How was that received?
It was definitely challenged. Critics argued his purely physiological view ignored the critical psychological meaning of the experience. Psychologist T.H. Pear famously critiqued Sargent, saying it was like trying to explain the emotional impact of Verdi's Requiem just by describing the mechanics of a record player. And another critic, Ian Ramage, pointed out a key difference. Pavlov's dogs recovered with sedation, implying a breakdown state, whereas human abreaction is an intense emotional release leading to recovery, which is arguably the opposite of a collapse into passive suggestibility.
Okay. What about the long-term effects? Did this intense brainwashing actually stick once people were out of that environment?
The sources strongly suggest it generally did not last once the individuals were removed from the coercive environment. The Korean POWs who had collaborated didn't remain communist once they were repatriated. Lifton's subjects back in Hong Kong didn't stay reformed long-term, though they did report lasting psychological effects like alienation or lingering fears. And Hinkle and Wolf noted that even after years of intense indoctrination, the effects could fade dramatically within months once the pressure was off.
Because they were back in an environment that didn't reinforce those specific ideas.
Precisely. One conclusion reached by author N.J. Brown is that normal social forces are often sufficient to achieve conformity, making extreme brainwashing techniques less necessary in a totally controlled society and largely ineffective outside of one. Though, you could argue this might dismiss the very real psychological struggles former members face, or it doesn't fully account for people who become social outcasts from wider society because they conform so intensely within a new exclusive group, like a cult.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for our daily lives, I think. If the mechanics used in those extreme cases rely on basic psychological principles, how do those same principles affect us constantly without needing a POW camp or a cult compound?
Well, the sources suggest this process starts incredibly early, in childhood. Through what's called indoctrination and socialization, Hans Talk argues this fundamental process can actually put psychological blinkers on us, limiting our perceptions of reality and making us deeply dependent on any belief system that gives us structure, preventing us from seeing nuance or shifting shades of gray.
How does that childhood indoctrination work then?
Peck outlines 4 key ingredients. First, limited perceptions a child's world is their parents, essentially, and their casual remarks gain this sort of infallibility just because they are the authority. Second, vulnerability and dependence a child conforms for approval, learning that love or acceptance might be conditional. Third, restricted information sources like POWs. Children can't easily validate information. They're continually exposed to a very limited set of viewpoints, often just 2 individuals. And fourth, identification children model themselves on their parents to find their own identity. And then socialization just reinforces this throughout life. Tucht claims society is sort of structured to provide wave after wave of relatively like-minded associates in our schools, towns, careers. This constantly reinforces the worldview formed early on. Even things we think of as rebellion, like, say, counterculture movements, can often just be variations on existing themes, changing the circumstances but not necessarily challenging the core assumptions forged way back in childhood.
So a lot of our fundamental beliefs are essentially baked in before we can even properly question them.
Often, yes. Author Eric Hoffer, in The True Believer, links this to why people are drawn to mass movements claiming absolute truth. They create a kind of fact-proof screen. He suggests our willingness to accept not understanding is governed by our deep need for certainty. And that vulnerability and dependence doesn't just vanish when we grow up. We can still be in situations with restricted information, think organized religions with non-negotiable doctrines. We still need to identify with people we respect, often unconsciously adopting their ideas. And conformity is just a baseline requirement of civilized society, subtly influencing behavior, as seen even in professions like psychotherapy, where trainees might conform to existing theories, as Jerome Frank described.
But we like to think we're making completely independent choices all the time.
And that's where the concept of perceptual set is so powerful. Tucht argues adults actually actively prevent themselves from seeing anything that contradicts their beliefs just so they can continue believing comfortably. We have this tendency to filter reality, to notice and absorb information that confirms what we already believe while ignoring or simply being unaware of conflicting information. It has a physiological basis. Our nervous systems would be overloaded if we tried to process everything, but the psychological result is this selective view of the world.
Like buying a new car and suddenly seeing that model everywhere you look.
Exactly, on a simple level, but apply that to beliefs. And it means your political stance, your opinions on people, your views on how the world works, they all get constantly reinforced by what your brain chooses to pay attention to and what you choose to ignore, often without you even realizing you're doing it.
And we build what's called an assumptive world. Is that right?
Sure. That's Jerome Frank's term, yes. We have to impose some order on complex, overwhelming experiences just to function. Basic assumptions like believing the sun will come up tomorrow are necessary. But others are deeply personal, coloring our values, expectations, our understanding of reality, often unconsciously. Changing those deeply entrenched assumptions is incredibly hard and can be emotionally unsettling because it challenges the very foundation of our reality. And collective assumptions, things treated as facts just because everyone believes them, they're rarely called into question unless something undeniable, like a major scientific discovery, reveals a contradiction.
Like maybe assuming people are generally decent and wouldn't intentionally harm others.
That was a core assumption dramatically challenged by the Milgram obedience experiments. Psychiatrists predicted almost no one would go beyond a minimal shock level, assuming individual moral standards would override instruction. But the results showed ordinary people, simply doing as they were told by an authority figure, would administer what they believed to be painful, even dangerous, electric shocks. Milgram felt the terrifying implication wasn't about aggression per se, but about the sheer power of social structure and authority to compel conformity, even against one's own moral code. He suggested very few people have the internal resources to resist authority in certain situations. Our assumptions about language also influence our behavior. Benjamin Lee Whorf described how workers treated empty gasoline drums as safe because the word empty made them perceive them as inert or null, ignoring the dangerous explosive vapor inside, which led to incredibly risky actions.
And labels themselves can become self-fulfilling prophecies. That sounds alarming.
Yeah, alarming studies in educational psychology cited in the sources show this happens routinely. If a teacher is told a child is a slow learner, they subconsciously lower their expectations and treat the child differently. The child internalizes this label and may actually become a slower learner, even if they weren't initially. The teacher's assumption limits the child's potential. And assumptions about appearance also play a role, influencing judgments by police, by juries, based on stereotypes. Studies have shown, for instance, that attractive defendants might receive more lenient treatment.
So much of our behavior isn't based on objective facts at all, but on these inferences and assumptions.
Yeah.
And we often resist questioning them, preferring to see exceptions to our rule rather than challenge the rule itself, often because we have an unwitting emotional investment in our existing beliefs. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and talk about conditioning. Pavlov and his dogs, everyone knows that story, but how does that relate to our susceptibility to influence?
Right. Classical conditioning, pioneered by Pavlov and championed by behaviorists like John Watson, it's about training automatic responses. A blast of air makes you blink. That's reflexive. Pavlov showed you could pair a neutral stimulus, like a bell, with an unconditioned stimulus, like food, that naturally triggers a response, like a dog salivating. Eventually, the bell alone triggers a salivation that's a conditioned response. And this applies to humans, too. Hearing words like roast chicken might actually make you salivate, as Perry London notes. Responses can also spread through generalization. A fear conditioned by one event, like Watson's famous little Albert being conditioned to fear white rats by pairing them with a loud noise. That fear might spread to similar objects or situations, like a fear of other white furry things. Discrimination is learning to differentiate and not respond to things that aren't the original stimulus. And like the POWs experiencing conflicting demands, stress can induce what Pavlov called experimental neurosis by presenting confusing or conflicting signals, preventing clear adaptation.
And fear itself is very easily conditioned.
Absolutely, as the little Albert experiment dramatically showed. Emotional responses are definitely conditionable, though maybe harder to extinguish than simple physical reflexes.
And the environment we're in plays a role in how we handle alarming experiences.
Yes, studies like Liddell's with lambs exposed to shock showed that a lamb experiencing the shock with its mother was significantly more resilient than a lone lamb. This suggests a stable, supportive environment acts as a kind of buffer, a finding that, can be generalized to how alarming experiences might impact children from stable versus insecure homes. Then there's operant conditioning, building on Thorndike's work and made famous by Skinner. This is all about shaping behavior through its consequences, rewards, or punishments. Actions followed by positive reinforcement are more likely to be repeated. Think of a rat pressing a lever for a food pellet.
Right, the classic image.
Exactly. But it's not always that straightforward. Sometimes, punishment can actually function as a positive reinforcer if it's the only way someone gets attention, as you sometimes see in institutional settings. And the schedule of reinforcement matters hugely. Intermittent, unpredictable rewards make behavior incredibly resistant to extinction compared to consistent rewards. Think about why people get hooked on slot machines but not vending machines, right?
And this is used consciously sometimes, like in behavior therapy. Rewarding a child for quiet nights instead of, say, screaming for attention.
Precisely. The unwanted behavior is ignored to extinguish it, and the desired behavior is rewarded. Or things like gradual desensitization for phobias, like agoraphobia, where carefully controlled exposure to the fear source while teaching relaxation helps the person learn that nothing terrible actually happens, breaking that pattern of avoidance that was actually reinforcing the fear.
But conditioning is often happening to us unconsciously, isn't it? That feels more insidious.
That's often where it's most powerful and lasting, according to the sources, yeah. Subtle, even unconscious cues can be more influential than overt rewards. A brief, unexpected smile from a jailer might have more effect on a prisoner than, say, extra cigarettes, because the prisoner isn't consciously aware of why it feels significant. Studies show that overtly rewarding children for eating greens made them stop eating them when the reward stopped, whereas children who were just told to eat them continued. The external reward actually undermined the internal motivation or perceived value. Incentive schemes can fail if unconscious social pressures, like group norms inhibiting increased productivity, are stronger reinforcers than the money offered.
Like the women's movement, highlighting how women were subtly conditioned perhaps to devalue themselves or suppress anger, leading to things like fear of success, where intelligent women might unconsciously undermine their own academic potential to avoid social repercussions.
Yes. And intellectual awareness of this conditioning doesn't automatically break its emotional hold. Assertiveness training can help challenge passive conditioning, sure, but the lingering guilt about not conforming to old roles can persist feeling guilty about not doing traditional domestic tasks, even when working full-time, for example. And repeated exposure, like to violence in news reports, can lead to conditioned helplessness and a blunting of feeling, a kind of desensitization. Anthony Burgess noted a lack of surprise when the Pope was shot, suggesting we've become conditioned to associate public figures with potential violent death. And a reporter's anecdote about a father seeing photos of his injured daughter captured this chillingly. The world has seen these pictures 1,000 times before. When did it ever stop anything?
The source also mentioned that controversial claim about military training using graphic films under forced conditions, supposedly designed to desensitize soldiers to killing, though the Pentagon denied that specific account.
Right. Whether or not that particular claim was accurate, it illustrates the concept. Deliberately applying desensitization techniques in extreme ways for a specific outcome. Language itself can become a conditioned stimulus, gaining emotional connotations unrelated to its meaning through association, as Perry London noted, like fearing the word dog because of a childhood scare, or specific words triggering physiological responses in experiments. Even subtle language use, like using he as a generic pronoun, can reinforce existing societal conditioning about gender roles. Lifton also observed how specific words in thought reform gained these almost mystical, morally charged qualities.
And conditioning can happen through incredibly subtle cues of approval or disapproval, even in just a conversation or therapy session, where the speaker believes they're arriving at their own ideas independently.
Exactly. Jerome Frank discusses studies stemming from Skinner's work, showing how experimenters or therapists subtly shape verbal behavior based on their own biases, simply by using subtle signs of approval or disapproval nods, changes in tone, brief, encouraging phrases like, uh-huh. The speaker is often completely unaware of this influence, subconsciously producing more of what the other person approves of and less of what they disapprove of. Studies confirmed therapists unintentionally do this based on their own personality traits, like their own comfort level with expressing hostility.
Wow. So conscious or unconscious, conditioning shapes our emotions, our habits, even seemingly voluntary choices. Perry London went as far as to claim the potential to teach almost any attitude, skill, or emotional disposition through combined conditioning techniques is more evident than any limitations on it. citing impressive experimental feats, from controlling bodily processes to inducing hallucinations. It really seems our most basic human needs and feelings make us especially vulnerable to influence.
They absolutely do. Juice-Meerlu believes that deep urge to conform, imitate, learn, it stems from our long period of dependency as children. We learn from our parents and others how to behave in ways that gain approval, leading to Carl Rogers' idea of conditional positive regard. We feel valued if we meet certain conditions, and if early needs for security and consistent responses aren't met, as described in Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, it can make navigating the world much harder later on, potentially leaving someone with identity confusion or this persistent need for external validation.
And frustration seems like a significant entry point for influence, doesn't it?
A very powerful one. Eric Hoffer describes how dissatisfaction with oneself or, unrealistic expectations about life can drive people to seek immediate, uncritically accepted solutions. They are, in his words, asking to be deceived. He links this frustration to a proneness for credulity and a distaste for facts or logic because they're seeking salvation from the miraculous. Cult members, often feeling lost or directionless, as seen perhaps with the Manson followers, find a powerful sense of belonging and identity in groups offering simple, absolute answers and extravagant hope, seeing leaders as saviors.
And cults often seem to deliberately manipulate feelings like hatred and love.
Yes. Fostering intense hatred of outsiders who are seen as evil and intense love and belonging for those within the group. Lifton termed this feeling of collective ecstasy, orgiastic oneness, when discussing confession. Relief from that deep frustration is a major draw, as felt by participants in groups like Emidest when they internalize that they've been living by other standards and feel justified in giving up. Guilt is another incredibly powerful lever. Society uses it to enforce rules, sure, but unfocused guilt, perhaps stemming from childhood conditioning around things like sexuality or perceived inadequacy, that can be manipulated. An interrogator or a group leader can play on this vague guilt, linking it to a specific crime or a wrong ideology, offering confession and conversion as the only path to relief from feeling like a terrible person.
And what about our ingrained obedience to authority?
Milgram's experiments demonstrated just how deeply ingrained this duty is, likely learned from childhood experiences that someone else is always in charge. This ingrained obedience can tragically override our personal moral codes. Milgram found the power of social structure to compel conformity, even against moral intuition, far more terrifying than just aggression itself.
It's really striking how few subjects in the Milgram studies actually refused to give the shocks, even when they were clearly distressed about it.
It is. Milgram noted they were often in visible conflict, but just didn't stop. They rationalized their behavior in various ways, immersing themselves in the technical procedure, seeing themselves as mere agents of the experimenter, or even justifying the victim's suffering. He must deserve it. The drive to obey, to maintain their word to the experimenter, and to avoid disrupting the social structure of the experiment seemed stronger than their discomfort or their moral sense. Variations on Milgram's study showed that factors like physically separating the teacher from the learner, making the victim less real, or having Confederates actors refuse to continue, or even lacking a clear authority figure, significantly impacted obedience levels. Obedience was highest when the victim was out of sight and lowest when the teacher had to physically touch the learner. And the presence of peers refusing was a powerful counter-influence. In that variation, the subject was actually conforming to his peers rather than obeying the experimenter.
So the need to conform to a group and social norms is just as powerful, maybe even more so sometimes, than obedience to a single authority figure.
Extremely powerful. Experiments like the autokinetic effect study, where people judged the apparent movement of a stationary light in a dark room, showed individuals quickly altered their perception to align with a group norm that developed spontaneously. We learn how to behave in new or ambiguous situations by imitating others, and this becomes habitual. The pressure for consensus in groups, termed groupthink by Irving Janis, can suppress dissenting opinions and lead to incredibly irrational decisions, especially in tightly knit groups with high morale and an illusion of invulnerability.
And the bystander effect, where responsibility diffuses in a crowd during an emergency, like that famous murder witnessed by 38 people. That's another chilling example of inaction becoming the powerful social norm, isn't it?
Correct. Darlene Latania's experiments on bystander behavior found that when you're alone during an emergency, the responsibility to act is clear. But when others are present, responsibility becomes ambiguous and a kind of inertia can take hold, with individuals reinforcing each other's inaction, making it feel like the socially acceptable thing to do, even in a crisis.
Okay, beyond conditioning and social pressure, What are some other key ways our attitudes and behaviors get influenced?
Well, commitment is a big one. As shown by Friedman and Fraser's foot in the door technique, getting someone to agree to a small request first makes them significantly more likely to agree to a much larger request later. And it's not just about getting them to say yes to you. Doing the small favor makes them start to see themselves as a helpful or agreeable person. Their action actually changes their self-perception and attitude.
And attacking someone's position can sometimes backfire,
Right.
make them more committed to it.
That's Charles Kiesler's boomerang effect. If you're already committed to a position and that position is attacked, you may actually increase your commitment to justify your previous behavior and beliefs. This is especially true if the initial commitment was high and the attack is strong enough to arouse defenses but not so overwhelming that you're forced to abandon the position entirely. This effect can make someone more open to extreme requests and even drive them to seek out others who are even more extreme for social support. It's why cults warning members about hostile deprogrammers can ironically strengthen the members' faith. Kiesler also points out that people often feel a strong need to believe their actions are self-instigated, even if they were initially coerced, as a way to reassert control when their freedom is attacked. As one expert noted, adopting the coerced behavior to an extreme degree, like Korean POWs marching to the bathroom when not required, can be a way of convincing yourself it was your own choice all along. This need to see actions as self-generated might explain seemingly illogical behaviors after direct coercion has stopped something debated in cases like Patty Hearst.
Okay, what about cognitive dissonance? That's a concept that comes up a lot in these discussions.
It's a really powerful psychological concept identified by Leon Festinger. It's basically the uncomfortable tension we feel when there's an inconsistency between our beliefs, attitudes, or actions. To reduce this tension, we're highly motivated to rationalize or change one of the conflicting elements, usually our attitude, to make it align with our behavior or other beliefs. Elliot Aronson notes we do this to appear rational, both to others and, importantly, to ourselves.
Like that famous case of the followers of the prophetess whose end-of-the-world prophecy didn't actually happen.
Exactly. Festinger studied Mrs. Keach's group. They were deeply committed, having given up jobs, possessions, everything. When the prophecy failed, they experienced massive dissonance between their strong belief and the undeniable reality. They reduced this tension by receiving a new message claiming their faith had actually saved the world, allowing them to keep believing. They even started seeking new converts to further validate their decision and reduce that lingering dissonance. People often cling fiercely to beliefs, even when disproven, to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of being foolish or duped. Another classic Festinger study showed people paid only $1 to lie about how interesting a boring task was, later rated the task as more interesting than those paid $20 to lie. The $20 group had a clear external justification of the money for their lie. The $1 group didn't, so they justified the lie by convincing themselves the task wasn't that bad after all, changing their attitude to match their behavior. Aronson's effort justification study is similar. People who suffered a severe initiation to join a discussion group later valued the group more, simply to justify the effort they put in.
So we're not just rational animals. We're rationalizing ones, constantly trying to make sense of things, even if it means shifting our beliefs.
Precisely. And this need to reduce dissonance also explains why people might avoid making decisions or taking responsibility, preferring extrinsic justifications, circumstances forced me, over intrinsic ones, I made this choice and I'm responsible. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo believes we treasure the idea of free choice, but often actively avoid exercising it. And the illusion that, others might be swayed by these forces, but not me, is itself a form of dissonance reduction that prevents us from learning from others' experiences, effectively working against taking control of our own lives.
And belief itself seems to have tangible power, like with placebos.
The placebo effect is truly remarkable. Jerome Frank points out that inert substances, sugar pills, can cause real physiological changes and improvements simply because the patient believes they will. The pill or treatment gains potency by being a tangible symbol of the physician's role as a healer. This is linked to suggestibility and the patient's belief that someone is in charge and can heal them, which can reduce anxiety and allow the body's own healing processes to work better. Even the color of a pill can influence its perceived effectiveness, as some studies have shown. And the mere sight of a weapon can also trigger more aggressive behavior, known as the weapons effect. Studies showed that the presence of a rifle, even just lying nearby, increased aggressive behavior in experimental settings. It might act as a conditioned stimulus or, as one researcher suggested, remind people of situations where aggression was rewarded, making aggressive actions seem more acceptable in that environment.
Role-playing also sounds like a surprisingly powerful mechanism for changing attitudes.
Yeah, psychologists have shown that actively improvising arguments for a position, even one you don't initially hold, significantly strengthens your attitude towards it. As one expert noted, the act of thinking up arguments to convince someone else often persuades yourself more effectively than just passively hearing information, because improvisation sort of bypasses rational deliberation. Writing something down has a similar reinforcing effect. A study showed students who wrote a summary of a passage became more strongly entrenched in its beliefs than those who just read it, even when told the information was made up. This active participation just makes the ideas gel in your own mind. It's used in therapy, like psychodrama, and, as we saw in thought reform, forcing prisoners to write confessions was a key tactic. Sensory deprivation experiments also demonstrate that monotony and lack of stimulation increase suggestibility, making people more receptive to propaganda or ideas they'd normally dismiss. Studies found subjects under sensory deprivation were significantly more susceptible to persuasive messages. Research suggests SD slows brain function and impairs intellectual capacity, making any neural event feel more important, allowing the mind to accept ideas it would otherwise filter out. One proposed scenario combined SD with conditioning and dependence to create a highly suggestible state, although these effects generally faded quickly once the conditions were removed, unless reinforced.
And how does hypnosis fit into this whole picture of influence? It always seems a bit mysterious.
Hypnosis is often described as a state of heightened suggestibility, yeah? Some experts believe it's simply an extreme form of normal suggestibility, or maybe role-playing, arguing that highly hypnotizable individuals can perform hypnotic feats just through suggestion without the formal induction. Others see it as a distinct state where things like pain relief go beyond mere suggestion or pretending. Andrew Salter viewed it as a form of conditioning, where spoken commands act as conditioned stimuli triggering established responses, like activating anesthesia systems for pain relief or causing hallucinations. There's significant debate on whether hypnosis can truly make someone act against their will. Some sources suggest it requires a relationship of trust and cooperation, where the subject feels the requested action is legitimate within the context, while others describe experiments where subjects under hypnosis perform seemingly antisocial acts, though arguably legitimized by the experimental setting or their trust in the authority figure. The debate around the Sirhan case, linking his actions to potential hypnotic programming through repetition, really highlights these complex questions.
So how do all these different elements, the conditioning, the needs, authority, dissonance, suggestion, how do they combine in these dramatic real-world situations, like cult conversions or intense interrogations?
Well, the sources suggest the psychological forces at play in sudden conversions, like joining a cult, aren't fundamentally different from those in historical brainwashing, even if they don't involve overt physical torture. Experts like Zimbardo point to common elements: building a close personal relationship, arousing intense emotion, guilt, fear, providing a new ideology that offers certainty, and using rituals and activities to create structure and belonging.
And that frustration we talked about earlier seems like a key factor in who gets recruited, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Eric Hoffer notes that people deeply dissatisfied with themselves or their lives are often more prone to credulity and seeking radical change, drawn to groups that offer simple answers and the promise of a miraculous transformation. Cults often share features with authoritarian systems, as analyzed by Edward Shills. Intense in-group exclusivity, demands for submissiveness, belief in hostile external conspirators, and a need to disrupt existing family ties, which compete for loyalty, as Hoffer also points out. The Mooney recruitment process described in the source illustrates many of these techniques applied systematically. There's inducing dependency by cutting off all ties, fostering dread by instilling fear of alienation or punishment for perceived wrong actions, debilitation through lack of sleep and poor diet, deception by presenting a false picture of the group, and desensitization to questionable actions like deceiving others for funds, as detailed by Margaret Singer. Practices like sharing sessions for forced emotional disclosure, using in-group language, surveillance, and attributing negative feelings to internal evil all reinforce conformity and shut down critical thinking. And repetitive lectures can induce these trance-like states, making people highly receptive to trigger words and ideas.
Wow. It really does sound like a conscious, systematic application of these influence techniques.
It is, and former members describe using thought-terminating phrases or intense meditation focused on intensity rather than depth to shut down doubt or uncomfortable emotions, reinforcing the no-thought policy encouraged by some cult leaders like Jim Jones, who famously told followers never to question, just obey. Ted Patrick, known for deprogramming, focused on forcing people to think again, challenging their programmed answers to try and break the cult's hold, noting that the fear converts had of deprogramming could initially make them even more rigid in their beliefs. The Manson family is another darker example. Manson operated through intense psychological manipulation, probing followers' deepest fears, fostering a no-thought state through drugs and total control, and using violence and rituals to desensitize them. He paradoxically remained a source of comfort amidst the very fear he created. The women who followed him often came from insecure backgrounds, searching for identity and a father figure, seeing him as a kind of messiah, as described by prosecutor Bugliosi.
And the Patty Hearst case seems to wrap so many of these elements together: kidnapping, political conversion, intense psychological pressure. It's fascinatingly complex.
It's a very complex case, often used to debate the concept of brainwashing, and the source material really explores this debate. Hearst was held in a closet, deprived of sensory input, threatened with death. She was systematically fed information designed to undermine her family and link her to their perceived crimes. She was forced into participation making tapes, undergoing weapons training. Then she was seemingly offered a choice to leave, which she later claimed felt like a test where returning home meant death.
But she stayed with the Symbionese Liberation Army survivors, didn't she? And participated in a robbery, even saved them at one point.
That's precisely where the debate lies. Experts supporting a brainwashing defense, like psychiatrist Louis Jolien West, pointed to strong parallels with the POW experience: disorientation, fear, dread, hopelessness, being made to feel her family had abandoned her. Those arguing against brainwashing, like Shefflin and Opton, emphasized her actions after the most overt coercion stopped, suggesting they reflected either choice or maybe personality factors, like a pre-existing dissatisfaction with her life, making her receptive to something radically new. Concepts like cognitive dissonance are absolutely key here. Her actions robbing a bank, staying with the group, needed internal justification. Perhaps by coming to truly believe in the SLA's cause, or maybe pretending the lifestyle was her own choice to regain a sense of control, as Kaesler's work on self-instigated action might suggest. The source suggests the Hearst case doesn't definitively prove or disprove brainwashing as some kind of total mind control, but rather highlights how powerful dissatisfaction and uncertainty about one's life can be, leaving someone ready to embrace something, anything, that provides answers and eliminates that uncertainty. It starkly illustrates that actions might not always stem wholly from within, and that even a decision made under duress might be no less free than one made while struggling with deep personal dissatisfaction.
So, is using a term like brainwashing sometimes just a convenient way to place blame somewhere else?
Yeah.
To avoid harder truths?
Well, Shefflin and Opton argue that calling it brainwashing is a comforting idea because it avoids the more difficult truth, that we are all susceptible to influence and can be led to do things that go against our normal standards. It puts the responsibility on an external force. The enemy is Satan, he was brainwashed, rather than acknowledging our own potential vulnerability. But arguing the opposite, that all such actions are purely conscious, uninfluenced choices also risks oversimplifying things and denying the reality of these powerful, often unconscious forces at work, including the fundamental socialization process that might predispose someone to seek absolutes instead of tolerating ambiguity, as Tosh points out.
Right. And the source material really broadens this lens beyond the extreme cases, looking at how influence operates in far more common everyday settings.
Yes, Edgar Schein noted striking similarities in the manner of influence applied in institutions like prisons, hospitals, or even schools, and in professions like psychotherapy or advertising, even though the content and goals are obviously very different.
Like in police interrogations, for instance.
The case of Timothy Evans, described in the source by Ludovic Kennedy, is a really troubling example. Evans, a man of subnormal intelligence, under immense stress, physical confinement, lack of sleep, tension about his wife's death, confused, isolated, and dependent on interrogators who genuinely believed he was guilty, made multiple false confessions to murder. This highlights how pressure, suspense, bewilderment, and suggestibility can combine to lead someone to confess to something they didn't do. Sargent suggested such intense stress can induce physiological states that cause collapse and heightened suggestibility, leading someone to mistake the intense relief of ending the interrogation tension for confessing a crime. The source even suggests the police officer's own strong belief in his guilt, combined with their own fatigue, could make them suggestible, leading them to accept the false confession, too. Illustrating Mirlu's point that those who easily influence others are often susceptible themselves, and Stargan's idea of examiner and suspect potentially diluting each other.
It sounds like the interrogation process itself can sometimes induce a state almost akin to hypnosis.
Mirlu suggests it can, yeah. Making the suspect's memory more passive and receptive to ideas or details suggested by the interrogator, allowing them to produce bits and pieces that conveniently fit the desired confession.
What about psychotherapy? That's meant to help someone, surely, not manipulate them.
Well, the sources are clear that even with the best intentions, therapists can unintentionally influence clients. Perry London notes, patients tend to identify with their therapists and gradually adopt their values, partly because the therapist focuses on what the patient themselves highlights as important. Jerome Frank adds that therapists subtly cue approval or disapproval of things a patient says, often unwittingly based on their own personality or biases shaping the conversation, as seen in Bandura's study. Frank also argues a therapist's refusal to take an active lead can create an ambiguous situation where the patient feels pressured to figure out what's expected and conforms. And the power dynamic is inherent too. The patient sees the therapist as an expert with the answers, fostering a degree of obedience similar to that shown towards other authority figures. Group therapy or encounter groups like the EDIS training described in the source can be even more intense. Sharing your deepest feelings in a supportive environment brings powerful relief and intense social approval, creating incredibly strong bonds with strangers very quickly. This highly emotional atmosphere, often involving stress or public confrontation, designed to break down old defenses before rebuilding individuals with the group's perspective, can generate intense feelings of love and trust for people one might normally feel conflicted about, creating a dependence on the group environment where that emotional breakthrough occurred, rather than necessarily fostering true independence.
In advertising, that's openly trying to influence us, obviously. But how does it tap into these deeper mechanisms we've been talking about?
Advertising employs many of the tactics we've discussed, using authority figures, actors dressed as scientists, doctors, or journalists presenting opinions. Appealing to the need for social approval, keeping up with neighbors, being seen with the right product. But sophisticated advertising uses psychographics, as detailed by Vance Packard, profiling target groups based on their deepest fears, guilt, and aspirations. They aim messages squarely at emotional weak spots, suggesting a product offers relief, playing on working parents' guilt to sell toys, for instance. Advertising also capitalizes on the audience's potential will to be deceived. We want to believe there's an easy solution, whether it's a slimming pill or achieving results without effort, even when evidence contradicts it. Repetition, of course, powerfully conditions associations, making brand names synonymous with entire product categories, think Hoover's, Xerox. And belief in a brand can actually enhance its perceived effectiveness, and seen in studies where branded analgesics provided greater headache relief than identical unbranded ones, especially for those loyal to the brand. Not just tactics like home trials leverage commitment and participation, as role-playing or actively using a product strengthens identification. Even subliminal advertising, though controversial and banned, demonstrated that the mind responds to stimuli below the conscious threshold.
So consciously or unconsciously, these powerful mechanisms of influence are just operating all around us, all the time. Okay, so after exploring just how susceptible we all are, what are some strategies for resisting undue influence, for taking back a bit more control over our own minds?
Well, the sources offer some crucial insights, often based on studying people who successfully resisted intense influence efforts, like some of those Korean War POWs or the crew of the USS Pueblo. One key element, noted by Mirlu, is maintaining your internal standards and cultivating emotional detachment. This means not just adopting the influencer's views or getting so swallowed by an intense experience that you lose all perspective. It requires recognizing that your feelings color your perceptions.
So if someone is appealing purely to your emotions, that might be a red flag, a reason to pause.
It could be, yeah. Recognizing that just because you like someone or they seem sympathetic doesn't mean their advice is sound. Emotional detachment is the opposite of emotional self-centeredness, where insecurity makes you interpret everything others say personally, hindering your ability to hear them objectively because you're too anxious about what they might think about you. Humor is a surprisingly powerful tool here. The Turkish POWs in Korea used humor to mock Chinese propaganda, as recounted by O.M. Burke. Humor lets you see things as they maybe should be, highlight absurdities, and maintain perspective. It requires a momentary suspension of belief, which helps you recognize distortion and not take the demagogue or the message deadly seriously. Beware humorless leaders or salespeople. Intellectual detachment is equally vital. Actively cultivating the capacity to think for yourself, to question things, to check facts, and to distinguish fact from opinion. As the Good Health Guide extract suggests, we often resist facts that conflict with our existing beliefs, especially if we have an emotional investment in holding those beliefs, like smokers who ignore the link to cancer. Questioning why you hold a belief, rather than just what it is, as Open University material advises, can transform blind belief into knowledge based on understanding, protecting you from being influenced by ignorance or unwitting emotional ties.
And taking responsibility for the information you accept, and for yourself generally.
Yes, absolutely. As Milgram's experiments starkly showed, relinquishing responsibility makes you far more susceptible. Even small acts of asserting control, like Biderman's anecdote about the Gestapo prisoner deliberately controlling when he would faint, can help maintain a sense of mastery in difficult situations and make you feel like you are acting rather than simply being acted upon. And finally, a core element in resisting influence and maintaining a balanced perspective seems to be the ability to tolerate ambiguity. To accept that opposing ideas or actions aren't always mutually exclusive. Our deep-seated desire for absolutes can make us cling to fixed ideas or, when those fail, just substitute one set of absolutes for another, leading to a dramatic conversion rather than a process of continuous nuanced change, as Toth points out. Studies showing the mind is capable of doing seemingly contradictory things simultaneously, like reading and writing at once, demonstrate our capacity for more open-mindedness and processing conflicting information than we might assume. Therapists often emphasize accepting life for what it is, including understanding how conditioning, emotions, needs, and assumptions affect us, as crucial for mental health, a form of self-awareness that is really key to resistance.
So this deep dive has really shown us that while the term brainwashing might be imprecise, maybe conjure dramatic, almost magical images, the underlying psychological mechanisms, conditioning, harnessing emotions, leveraging our social needs and authority, exploiting cognitive dissonance, shaping perception through assumptions, and so much more are constantly at work, subtly and not so subtly, shaping our thoughts, feelings, and actions every single day.
Yeah, we've seen how deeply ingrained patterns from childhood and just the sheer power of our social environment contribute to this vulnerability. Our fundamental human needs for certainty, for belonging, for approval can make us susceptible to influence in ways we might not want to admit. And our desire for absolutes can make us cling to fixed ideas instead of tolerating ambiguity, making us easier targets, perhaps.
It seems clear that believing we are somehow immune to these powerful forces, or that only weak or gullible people are affected, is perhaps the most dangerous assumption of all, because it prevents us from seeing these forces at work in our own lives and learning from others' experiences.
Absolutely. Understanding these mechanisms is the essential first step toward greater autonomy. Recognizing how perceptual set filters our reality, questioning the assumptions we live by, rigorously investigating why we believe things, practicing emotional and intellectual detachment, and cultivating the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, these are the vital tools we have, tools to become more self-directed and less simply acted upon by forces we don't fully understand.
It really makes you step back and wonder if so much of what goes on in our minds and shapes our behavior is driven by forces we're barely aware of. How much of what you believe, or what you decide to do tomorrow, is truly your choice?